Today on Straight Talk Africa, a look at the recent Sudanese power sharing agreement. Could this effort bring about the badly needed fundamental political change in Khartoum? That discussion is coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America headquarters here in Washington. I am Shaka Sali, and today we are taking a closer look at the power sharing agreement that has been signed in Sudan. After weeks of violent protests and difficult negotiations, Sudan's pro-democracy coalition and the ruling military council signed a peace deal Wednesday as part of a power-sharing deal aimed at leading the nation on a path to democratic elections. My colleague Paul Ndiho has more on the story.
Sudan's ruling military and pro-democracy movement on Wednesday signed a political document that is part of a power-sharing deal meant to end the country's deadlock after weeks of stalled talks. The two sides, representatives from the military council and the Forces for the Declaration of Freedom and Change, signed a so-called political declaration, one of the two documents that are part of the deal, at a ceremony in Khartoum. The other document, a constitutional declaration, is likely to be signed within days, perhaps as early as Friday.
It is a great moment that the people of the Sudan have reached this historic moment. The parties, I would not say the different entities of the Sudan, but a unit, a united front that represents the gallant army of the Sudan, the Transitional Military Council, and of course, the revolutionary youth, intellectuals, pioneers who have taken to the streets to stand for democracy.
The signing is a key step in Sudan's transition after months of street protests that prompted the military to overthrow long-time leader Omar al-Bashir and take over the country in April. He tightly ruled Sudan for 30 years. In the days following the coup, the military generals announced they would set up a transitional military council to run the country for up to 2 years. But pro-democracy demonstrators firmly rejected that plan. In early July, the Transitional Military Council and the coalition of pro-democracy groups called the Forces of Freedom and Change reached an agreement, ending the dispute between via joint sovereign council, with power shifting between military and civilian leadership. Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, deputy chairman of the Transitional Military Council and chief of the Rapid Support Force, says the agreement covers everybody.
The deal that we have been waiting for a long time has been agreed on, and this agreement needs unity and purity of intent.
The African Union and Ethiopian government officials assisted in mediating the deal. Omar Al-Qadir, a representative of the Forces for Freedom and Change, says the government now has its eyes clearly on the peace deal.
This agreement opens the way for the establishment of institutions of transitional authority, which will carry out reform programs in the political, economic, and social fields. One of the priorities of this government will be to focus on the cause of peace.
A lot of mistrust has surfaced between the two sides when government security forces killed dozens of people when they broke up a sit-in demonstration in June. But with the help of mediators, the two parties ironed out their differences to establish a sovereign council, rotating between the military and civilian for 3 years. After the agreement was announced, thousands of people took to the streets in jubilation, waving Sudanese flags, dancing and embracing each other. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that interesting report. Joining us today are three distinguished guests. Dr. Shaza El-Mahdi, Sudanese physician and human rights activist and member of the preliminary committee of the Sudanese American Physicians Association. Atem Galang Deng Akwek, former deputy speaker for the Sudanese National Assembly and a former chief whip in South Sudan, and is currently a member of the South Sudan government. And joining us via telephone link from the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, is Michael Atiti, a freelance journalist who covered the Sudanese protests and has been on the ground leading up to the signing of the power-sharing agreement. I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the three of you on Straight Talk Africa for the first time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome.
I'm happy to be here today and to meet you.
I'm glad.
And then we talk over issues of Sudan.
I'm glad that you came.
Thank you.
Let's begin, of course, with Michael Atit, who happens to be physically on the ground in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Ndugu Shaka.
How are you, Ndugu Michael?
I'm doing good. I'm doing great.
You're doing good.
Thank you very much for...
You're doing good. I thought that you would probably be doing hugely terrific, especially given that today something major happened in Khartoum, the agreement.
Yes, yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Ndugu Shaka, and thanks to your two guests who are in the studio, and also thanks to the viewers and listeners of the Straight Talk Africa, this great program that focuses on Africanism. Yes, today is a very big day. It's been described by leaders of Africa here at the talks in Sudan. And I have to remind our listeners that these talks has come as a result of a unique series of talks. Last night, the talk started at around this time, and it goes last night up to the morning. This is where the parties were able to sign a political declaration this morning. And it was a very great news to the Sudanese as they are waking up. They wake up on this news on TV and on radios, and you could see a mixed reactions among the Sudanese communities here in Khartoum and in diaspora and also in the other states. Others were chanting, celebrating, but they still don't forget the issue of freedom, peace, and justice. So whenever they are gathering, celebrating, they are still reminding the ruling council, military council, and the Freedom and Change Coalition, they're still reminding them that even if you're going to form a civilian government, we will still not forget our dear ones who lost their lives during the revolution recently. So they chanted slogans like blood versus blood. Even if you form a civilian government, we still need justice for our dear ones. So this is the main situation and main call by the Sudanese on the streets. And of course, even if there are those who might not be in line with the agreement, it is very difficult at this situation and at this moment to find, a group or whatever coming out clearly stating that we are against this agreement. I have to remind you, Shaka, that the Sudanese Communist Party, which is a member in the Freedom and Change Declaration forces, and then the Revolutionary Front, they came out clearly this afternoon, stated that they are not supporting this agreement because the agreement seems to be sidelining a lot of issues. They regard it as a fundamental issues. The agreement seems to be giving a military power, military junta, a lot of power, a lot of, upper hand on certain issues to do with the sovereign of the Sudan. So these are few things, few maybe political groups that came up clearly and say no, they don't support this agreement by now.
Now, Michael, you know as well as I do that signing an agreement is the first part and is the easier part. Now, what about the second part, the next step of making sure that you restore peace and stability on the ground? Do you see something like that reflected in the manner in which the ordinary Sudanese who has been protesting for a very long time on the ground, do they feel like they have won, that something indeed is going to happen on the ground, something tangible, something concrete?
Well, Shaka, something that I see which is tangible and concrete is the determination of the Sudanese people demanding change, demanding freedom, demanding peace and justice. So this voice, whenever it continues and it is not being silent, and I think it will still remind the military rulers or whatever transitional government that is coming that they have to do something tangible in order to correspond with the calls and the voices of the Sudanese people who are on the street. And I think this is the only thing that is being used currently as a real pressure, if I could use this, that is a real pressure that is on the street, that is all over Sudan, even abroad and even in the diaspora, calling on the leaders of the Sudan to at least do something to bring lasting peace in the country. I have to remind you and our listeners that a few days ago, forces, political and armed forces who are not part of the Freedom and Change Coalition have been meeting with the representatives of Freedom and Change in Addis Ababa, and they have actually reached to a preliminary agreement that they support the stand of the Freedom and Change Coalition in order to bring stability and peace back to the country. The only 2 or 3 main groups that are still not yet part of this process currently going on is the SPLM North, led by the General Abdulaziz Adam Al-Hilu in South Kordofan, Nuba Mountains. And also you have Abdul Wahid in Darfur. He is still even not yet part of this process currently going on. But I think both military council and the Freedom and Change and with other armed groups and political groups who are within Sudan, they are working towards unifying all these forces, unifying all these armed groups together, and bringing on the table the issue of the Sudan, bringing up the Sudanese. Let us do something for Sudan and for the Sudanese people as Sudanese political and whatever leaders. So this is something that Ndugu, if it continues to come, this might push Sudan forward and give Sudan, a very good example in Africa.
Well, Michael Atit, I hate to say it because time happens not to be our best ally. And on that note, I have to thank you so much, and I'm saying this from the deepest, better part of the bottom of my Kavali heart and soul. Thank you so much for your insight, and good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you and to your guests in the studio and to our listeners and viewers of Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you again. Thank you very again. Let me come to you immediately, Dr. Shaza El-Mahdi. You told me earlier that under no circumstances are you related, for example, to Sadiq Al-Mahdi, a man who happened to be having the distinction of being the Prime Minister, elected the Prime Minister of Sudan, not once but twice, and twice being overthrown by the military.
Yes. Thank you again. My last name Al-Mahdi, it has no relation with the Sadiq Al-Mahdi. But having that said, I know and I understand my family has some sort of relation with Al-Ansar.
The Great Mahdi.
Yes.
Interesting.
They are coming from the same area in northern Sudan.
Interesting.
Yes.
Now, you are a Sudanese. How do you feel like the agreement has been signed?
Well, first of all, I have to say that as Sudanese living outside the country, I'm so proud of what is going on in Sudan. And I'm so proud of my fellow citizens who, for the last 6 months, have proven that they can make change, and they did. Despite the fact that we are at the very, I still look at it this way, we are at the very early stage of our radical change. And as an activist, I understand, after 30 years of being under al-Bashir's regime, there is no way that we can make a radical change in one single night. But I understand that our country has crossed the turning point, and there is no way that Sudan will be the same that it was before April 11.
Talk to me about the fact that women, the Garant women of Sudan, were in the lead. They pretty much led this revolution.
That's true. And actually, throughout our history, women were at the very forefront of all kind of change that happened in our community. Just a quick view to our history, we have the women who were first been elected into the parliament in 1960s. At that time, I believe the Northern Africa region and the Arab countries and other neighboring countries, they haven't had that experience. So we started very early. If we have got the chance to go through that line in the same passion and the same mechanism, we would have gone way far than what we are right now.
Very interesting, very interesting.
But we have been going through some sort of a very brutal regime that was targeting women intentionally and setting laws after laws to oppress them. We do have different kind of laws that mainly targeting women, like the Public Order Act. I still remember when I went to the medical school, I wasn't even allowed to go like that and enter my college.
Did that only affect women, or it affect those probably who happened to think that...
There is discrepancy, and there is kind of those from the northern part, they have taken some sort of privilege from the system, and we understand that. But having that said, we as Sudanese women, as general, we've been targeted by the different kind of laws, the public order law, the indecent clothes, which is very subjective, and it does depend on how the police officer or the judge or whoever in the court see that. But talking about the revolution, the Sudanese women have been leading the revolution, organizing it from the back end, treating the victims as doctors, teaching their students, mobilizing the communities. And I've seen them, inspiring them.
Very interesting.
By even what we call as gharid and all these things that makes, in our culture, when they do that, they make it a kind of very spiritual thing for women, for men and women to participate.
I'm afraid we have to try to be a little bit democratic, and if we're going to introduce democracy in the Sudan, we have to begin it right here, in Studio 47. Sure. Let me come to you immediately, Atem Galang. What is your immediate reaction to what happened today in Khartoum? You happen to be a former Deputy Speaker of the Sudanese National Assembly.
Yes, what happened today in Sudan, I'm happy with it. Is that the Sudanese people have actually defeated anarchy which was going to happen in their country. If they go for another 3-4 months without agreement, then chaos can happen, like what happened in Libya. So I do congratulate them. This is a good spirit. Some people may not be happy because the junta have almost half of the Supreme Council, but it's still, because the former regime, which has been there for 30 years, has recruited so many militias.
But what about some of these members of the Military Transitional Council, which is part of the essentially the National Sovereign Council? Were they not working with the former president, Field Marshal Omar al-Bashir? Are we really looking at a fundamental change here, or are we in fact looking at a change of guards?
No, now the fundamental change will not happen as those people, they have guns, and they can gun down citizens as they have done on the 3rd of June. And to avoid this is to work with them for at least the coming 39 months. And it is good in the agreement, there is a provision which is saying whoever is going to be in the council, this Supreme Council, or you become a member, or a member in the Council of Ministers, or a governor of the state, you will not contest the coming elections.
That is great.
So it means there is a blockage there in front of us. So they have to rule with the civilians. They can be tolerated because the Sudanese have tolerated Bashir for 30 years. So they can tolerate them for the coming 39 months.
Right. Yeah. Great idea. But let me again come to you, Shaza. You know that there have been so many agreements signed in the Sudan before. One of the perhaps most fundamental agreement was the CPA, the Naivasha, the agreement, which worked. And at one time, I remember when Dr. Kano John Garang was still alive, he was on this program on Straight Talk Africa, and he was talking about the CPA. And I said, wait a minute, what guarantee is there really that this CPA at the end of the day is going to deliver results? And he rightly said, Shaka, this time around, this is going to work. And the reason is very simple, because it is guaranteed by the IGAD Plus.
Yes.
We were talking then, of course, about Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
Yes.
So what about this particular deal? Who guarantees it? The African Union?
The Sudanese protesters.
Very good.
Yes. And actually, the Sudanese protesters are the ones who were putting more pressure on both parties to come and finalize a deal on the Freedom and Change Declaration groups and on the TMC, the Transition Military Council. And I think the main idea behind, there are some international community involved, including the mediation that is being led by the Ethiopian government and the one that was led by the African Union. And we really appreciate, we as Sudanese, we appreciate what the African Union has been done so far.
And what about the role, for example, of Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed?
Yes, I said the Ethiopian government has led the role. And yes, he's done a great job in that. And actually, that's good because it gives some sort of balance in our region. We always rely on the international community from Western countries. And now it's back to our African Union to function in the right direction. And I think the first decision they have taken earlier is to suspend the Transition Military Council or Sudan membership until they handle the authority to civilians government. But I would say that the Sudanese people themselves are the only group in the scene that I see could guarantee that this deal will function.
Or part of groups that could guarantee, because let's be very realistic here. Those Sudanese people you are talking about do not have money, nor do they have guns, correct?
Yes.
So they need somebody to protect them.
No, but in the agreement, as she is saying, there are two provisions in the agreement at the end of it. And I think those two was put there to make sure that Sudanese who have signed this agreement, they will respect also the opinion of the external forces like IGAD, African Union, the European Union, the United States, and the United Nations.
You're talking about respect for opinion in a society that has no relationship with democracy.
No, not all democracy or opinion. But what I want to say in the agreement is that they are appealing the two sides, the military and the freedom.
Is IGAD Plus playing a role here?
Pardon?
IGAD Plus.
Yes. They are saying that we appealed to those partners to make sure that money is raised to assist the Sudan government, the new one, the new regime. And then again, they are appealing to the United States so that the sanctions which were placed on Sudan are relieved from there. So I think they want this, they want to come to the international camp, and you cannot come to international camp unless you behave.
Now, let's talk about the issue of selecting of the cabinet. There are two key positions. One is the defense minister,
yes,
and the other is interior minister.
Yeah.
These are two crucial,
yes,
and you need to have these men and women who hold those positions to be men or women of integrity,
yes,
and character in order for this revolution to succeed. And yet, the responsibility is up to the members of the military, of the Sovereign Council. Was that a good idea?
No, that is one of the biggest strategic mistakes that have been done in the drafted agreement, which is basically leaving the national security and the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Defense to the military groups, having this mentality that the military groups are the one who should design anything related to these two ministries. And these exceptions from the interior government cabinets, which are supposed to be civilians, it does just reflect how deep the crisis is in our community. And I believe even those who are leading the process of negotiation with the Transitional Military Council are somehow embedding this idea that the military should be in charge of taking this process. And for me, part of the problem is that this military has gone through too much destruction from the previous regime. It's not a well-institutionalized institution. There are too many militias that are functioning outside the Sudanese army.
You're not talking about the Janjaweed, are you?
I'm talking about the Janjaweed. I'm talking about those people who have been recruited based on tribal affiliation.
I thought their role has been virtually neutralized.
No, actually, those are the same people. Those are the same perpetrators in their crisis.
Were they supporters of Field Marshal Omar Bashir or supporters of the military?
They support whoever pays them.
Yes.
And that's true. That's a bad thing about everything. They fight in Yemen because they get paid by Saudi government and Emirati government. This is not our fight as Sudanese. We actually feel so sympathy towards our brothers and sisters in Yemen.
Very interesting.
So the Al-Janjaweed are actually get paid by even the European Union, and I know they released a statement a couple of days ago by the spokesperson of the EU distancing themselves from the Rabbit Front. Yes.
No, Doctor, someone might of course say that you are basically simply saying something that does not have evidence. Do you have incontrovertible evidence
there is something
not liable to falter on that?
There is Khartoum process. They pay the government of Sudan, which the government of Sudan was paying Al-Janjaweed to guard the borders between Libya and Sudan and prevent illegal immigrants from crossing the Mediterranean Sea.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, Atem,
yes,
talk a bit about the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, are we looking, at least for the first time, a legitimate new bleed of African leaders here? You saw what he did with neighboring Eritrea. You saw what he did with people who belong to groups that were opposed to the government in Addis Ababa. Now you can see what he has actually helped to do in Khartoum. Are we looking at a legitimate new breed of African leaders, not the type that were defined for us by the American administration under Bill Clinton?
Yes. The Prime Minister of Ethiopia is a dynamic man. And this is the man for this century, the 31st century. It's not archaic, it's modern, it's brave, and he's focused. First of all, he wants to make sure there is peace in Ethiopia. And when you have peace, you will guarantee unity of the people. Peace means development. Development means at least the poverty we are in.
What makes him tick? He lives in a neighborhood, sincerely,
yes,
that has not known democracy for not only decades, but for centuries.
No.
What makes him tick?
No, well, the democracy, you know, it is a part of life of Africans in the rural areas. And the preference of all the cities of Africa where the poor people are, they are more democratic than the...
You are very, very right. As a matter of fact, we've been talking about how traditional African societies,
yes,
for the most part,
yes,
they are in fact democratic.
yes,
The problem is these people who end up controlling this thing called the state,
yes,
the government.
yes.
Why are they different from their parents?
No, they become corrupt because, of course, they come from our background. You are democratic, but you are poor. When they come to the authority, they have the resources in their hands, and the institutions for accountability in Africa are weak. Either we weaken them deliberately, especially the elite, they become the looters of their own people, and they form a class, a new class in the society. But otherwise, when we go back to...
Is it something that we learn, for example, in some of these Western educational institutions? Because let's face it, a lot of our university graduates end up really becoming experts in consuming as opposed to producing,
yes,
and sharing.
We inherited from the colonizers because they have trained us to become masters, not servants of our people, to become people who are better than others, because they found us, most of the African countries, well illiterate.
To be patriotic to your stomach,
yes,
the stomach of your family,
yes,
and the stomach of your friends probably, and a few relatives.
Yes.
But not society.
No, not society, because society will feel, what is it, if suppose you are praised by your society that you are a good person and then you have done this, but you are poor. They will say, oh, no, he's a crazy guy. He has been there. But what I want to say, Abiy, if he gets the right support from Ethiopian people, and Ethiopian people, they have had a government for the last 3,000 years. They are not like other Africans who just 100 years or 120 years where they have gone through a system which is centralized. But for Ethiopian, they have got 3,000 years. So I think they will benefit from those experiences, and Abiy will succeed, because he's a man of peace.
Unfortunately, time happens not to be our best ally. When the producer says go, you have to go. There's no democracy in Studio 47. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment, so please don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about,
sharing stories of development and growth across Africa,
around the world, and in our lives.
Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices
with me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick,
and Hadiza Kiari,
and Ayan Bior,
and Orion Itangi Shaka.
It's time for Our Voices.
Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. What is your opinion about today's topic? Call us at 202-619-3111. U.S. country code 1. When you call, remember the following. Ask only one question. Keep your comment brief and turn down the volume on your radio or television. Now let's return to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizi-Yuwat, and we appreciate all of the audience feedback. Straight Talk Africa streams live every Wednesday on Facebook. You can watch our show there and leave a comment. Now let's look at what's on tap for next week's program.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Area is now a reality that, if successful, will create a $3.4 trillion economic bloc and usher in a new era of development across the continent. There is hope a new deal will boost cross-border trade, but poor infrastructure and corruption could slow down the process. A closer look at Africa's free trade agreement on the next Straight Talk Africa.
Today we are discussing the signed power sharing agreement in Sudan. Is it enough to restore peace and stability in the country? Our guests are Dr. Shaza El-Mahdi, a Sudanese physician and human rights activist and a member of the preliminary committee of the Sudanese American Physicians Association, and Atiem Garang Deng Kwek, former Deputy Speaker for the Sudanese National Assembly and former Chief Whip in South Sudan and a member of the current South Sudan government. I have to say again, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa for the first time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Oh, you're most welcome. Let me come to you immediately again, my sister, Shaza. Do you think that perhaps not only Sudan, but that Africa probably needs a sort of paradigm shift in the manner in which our rulers really, because they are not leaders, because most of those people in power do not in fact lead their people, because they do not consult them. They simply wake up and decide you have a road between A and B without worrying or even caring really about the people who live around there, whether in fact that is the most important thing that they need. Do we need a sort of paradigm shift here?
Yes, yet I think we need a paradigm shift in here. And I actually, from what was going on in Sudan in the last 6 months, I believe that has proven one thing. There is some sort of dynamic that is going underneath the very quiet and calm surface. Those young generations who were born and raised and went to school under al-Bashir's regime, and they were consumers to the curriculum they've been receiving in schools, which was based on jihadist, Islamist, Islamo-Arabic ideologies, those have proven in the street that they do have the determination and the ability to change the strategy that has been written by al-Bashir's regime, for example, in Sudan. And when I see them demonstrating in the street, so determined and focusing on just one goal, which is peace, justice, and freedom, I kind of get struck by where are they getting these ideas from and why they are making, what kind of change they would be making in our country and in the neighboring countries as well. And I think that's because they do have lots of resources. The internet as a platform that has been consumed by the Sudanese revolution to the point where the TMC decided to shut down the access to internet and create some sort of internet blackdown right after the massacre that has taken place in June.
So is it possible that perhaps when you look at the changing demographics, for example, in tandem with the social media, which exposes them, Are these the tools that we need in order to bring about fundamental changes in our societies?
We can use it, and we can always look for other tools to make fundamental change, but the technologies just paved the road for us. And I believe the Sudanese revolution was probably the first one.
They provide the roadmap.
Yes, exactly. This, I mean, still we need to think of some sort of other kind of approach that could take us through this dilemma. And I believe, and I believe the Sudanese people, they don't really like to have another system that is replicant to the one happened in northern Sudan, in Egypt, for example. They don't want the revolution to be stolen by the military to end in a point where we have a system like similar to Sisi's system.
You probably need to borrow a leaf, at least from Tunisia.
Yes.
Now, let me ask you, Atem, you've been right there in the political front line. You've been one of those people that have had the power, really. When you look at people, there are times when people say, when a country has a leader like Omar Bashir, who actually stays in the State House for 30 years, that is equivalent to peace and stability. Is that peace and stability especially sincerely when there is the absence, for example, of social, economic, political justice? In other words, in short, is the fact that there is the absence of war, that people are not fighting and what have you, does that necessarily translate into peace and stability? Because you have really a population that is almost, or could be characterized as willing victims, really. And why are these victims victims? Is it because they are not socially and politically conscious? And if they are not, why?
Well, let us look into the issue this way. Al-Bashir has ruled this Sudan for 30 years, but there have never been peace there. There was war in the South Sudan. He found it was there. He came in 89, 89, and the war was there until 2005.
And he presided over the disintegration of what was otherwise the single largest country in land mass on the continent.
Now, again, when the peace agreement was signed with the South Sudan, then the Darfur case came in. So there have never been peace there. Now, the Sudanese in Khartoum, who have been always brainwashed by Bashir, that what happened in Darfur, there was nothing, and I'm referring here to the internet and to the mass media, which is now have exposed the Janjaweed, what they have been, people now have started, Sudanese have started to believe what happened in Darfur, it was bad, because they did not see it, they were hearing it, but now they have seen it in Khartoum.
But and even when you talk about brainwashing by Omar Bashir, what exactly do you mean?
Well,
and how does he in fact do it?
You know, he brought a system which he tried to preach people about religion. And he started to change the curriculum of the schools.
Is he a particularly religious man himself?
No, I doubt him. He's not even Hassan al-Turabi. They were ideologists.
At least Dr. Hassan al-Turabi could make a bit of a claim.
Religious leader in a sense.
No, he could be a good thinker, but not a religious person. For that, he can think well.
Could be an ideologue.
Yes, exactly. Now they want to change the mentality of the people of Sudan into what they believe is correct, so they can rule. Because if you become an Amir, then an Amir, nobody will oppose him. Because according to them, the Islam said, you cannot oppose your ruler. If you oppose your ruler, then you are also opposing your religion.
But don't these people, frankly, think about posterity? Don't they think about legacy? Or at least like the Madiba, a former South African president, Nelson Mandela.
But how many of them in Africa? Bashir.
A man who served one term.
Yes.
And he was actually constitutionally allowed to serve 2 terms. The man was so popular that even when he died, South Africans would probably actually even vote for his body.
But now you have in Sudan you have 3 military rulers. One, Ibrahim Aboud, from 1958 to 1964, was there.
The students took care of him.
Again, Nimeri came from 1969 to 1985, and now al-Bashir. So you see the country has been ruled by military. And then you go to Uganda. You have seen Okelas and Idi Amin.
Yes.
You see Central Africa, Bokassa.
Look at the neighborhood.
Yes, and Mobutu.
Yeah. But
except Kenya and Tanzania.
You go to what was Belgian Congo.
Yes.
Then became Congo,
yes.
Then Zaire.
Yes.
Then
even the name of the country.
Now the Democratic Republic of Congo.
They change as they wish. Even the name of the country. So now,
look at that neighborhood.
But the point is this.
And then South Sudan.
The point is this. The West is behind all this also. Even Bashir, it became a Western toy later on.
Yeah, but what about, you talk about the West, this is a diversion, Ali.
Yes.
What about the Sudanese people themselves? What about the Ugandan people themselves? What about the Congolese people?
Well, let me just tell you one thing. I just wanted to mention that for me as a physician, it might not be really different, the number of people that are died in the hospital because of having access to oxygen cylinder.
Really?
And the number of those who died on the battlefield because of direct bullets. In a regime like al-Bashir's regime, we've witnessed lots of unpreventable death. That is happening every day. So if you are going to count on those who lost their lives, there are people losing their lives every day because of starvation, because of having less access to medical treatment, because of lots of things that are preventable. So does it really consider as is it really considered as stability and peace in our society?
No.
I don't think that's true.
It is very interesting, Doctor, because in fact I think one of these days we should actually have a discussion on that medical care issue. You are talking about some of these countries, sincerely, where senior government officials have a budget to go pretty much what some would characterize on medical tourism. They have destroyed whatever medical infrastructure was in their country, and so they have no confidence whatsoever in their medical caregivers. They actually go for medical checkup in India,
yes,
in Europe,
yes,
in North America, in South Africa, on the backs of their poor taxpayers. There have actually been situations where, I am not going to name this particular president in the region, he actually sent his daughter to give birth in Germany on a presidential jet, and this daughter was not even sick.
Yeah.
So what about those other thousands and millions of other women, sincerely?
Well, that's the sad truth. In Sudan, most of the budget, most of the public budget goes to the military, to the Sudanese intelligence and security services, and basically,
and the relatives.
Exactly, and the corruption takes big bite of that as well, because literally they pay to buy loyalty and to be surrounded by those who were defending someone like al-Bashir until the last moment in his governance. So that's true. We've always been having less than 5% for health and education in Sudan. And actually,
most of the money is allocated to buying military gears,
yes,
weapons to kill their own people.
Yeah.
That's true. And actually, this is a big challenge because my own belief is that what has taken al-Bashir down is not just the public demonstration, but also the economic crisis. So the al-Bashir is gone, and the economic crisis is still there. The new government will be facing the reality that the economic crisis is still there.
Especially because the West rejected him.
Yes, exactly. So the question would be, would the West support or whatever kind of international support for the interim government, would that help lift the country through the economic crisis in the next few years? That's a big question. Would there be any kind of approach to locally invest in the Sudanese resources, to find other kind of innovative ideas to restructure the economic system in Sudan to make it more functional? That's a big question that is facing the transitional government. And I guess it's a very challenging question.
Very interesting.
But I think, yes, it's a challenging, but I think there will be solution for economic problem in Sudan. Because
what are some of the solutions that
some of the solutions? First of all,
suggest?
For sure, the West will know that there is no terrorism support in Sudan. This is one.
But the West wants to continue having access to GAM Arabic.
No, there's no problem there. Yes, the Sudanese will be ready to sell it, and they are selling it to them. Number two, the war will stop in South Sudan, and the production of the oil in South Sudan will go up. When it goes up, then Sudanese, through the pipelines, through the port in Port Sudan, where the South Sudanese are exporting their oil, then Sudan will be paid. So it will increase their income, actually. And then I'm quite sure corruption of Umar al-Bashir system will not be there. It may be there, it will not be very high.
I mean, what about the gold? Could the gold currently is the main source of hard currency in Sudan? And it is controlled by Hemeti, the second person at the TMC. So this really...
And you know, when they put also these Islamic laws, the tourism in Sudan, it was to the minimum. Believe me, if they now make at least some laws which will allow the tourists to go, because historically, north of Khartoum is all areas of tourism. And that's for the wildlife in it.
Let me ask you this question. You obviously at one time belonged to the Republic of Sudan.
Yes.
And now you are a happy member of the Republic of South Sudan.
Yes.
If somebody were to ask you why you separated from Khartoum, whether it was worth it and what have you, what would be your immediate answer, really? You have a very huge country,
yes,
very, very incredibly wealthy,
yes,
with no people, really,
yes,
and yet you have actually failed to share in the God-given resources.
Yes.
And you are in the business of eliminating and killing one another, while you should in fact be developing that country and perhaps having a very generous and active immigration system, where some Africans, instead of dying while crossing in the Mediterranean, supposedly going for greener pastures in Europe, would be in South Sudan.
Yes, you know, it's a long history. Before the independence of Sudan in 1956, Southern Sudanese requested from Sudanese, Northern Sudanese. Our country we are a country with very deep diversities. And to rule this country in a good way, let us have a federal system. We have our identity, you have your identity, but let us be one country.
You have to have justice, justice.
And they said...
Isn't justice really an equal opportunity employer, really?
But that is the justice. You know, the justice will not come unless you have structures of which you will implement this or you will differentiate this justice. When Southern Sudanese asked for that, then it was said, okay, now we are brothers. Let us vote together for the British to go away from us.
But you had the advantage, for example, of being in a position where you could learn from other experiences, sincerely, around you and far beyond.
No, but this what...
Any particular reason why you decided to adopt the worst mannerisms, really, that some of these countries had exhibited?
It wasn't what the worst one, but because there were no peace in Sudan. And then, you know, the Sudanese, what they did. So you're not Sudanese people, but the rulers, those who are ruling. And you have seen in Africa, those elites who are looting their people. In Sudan also, they were looting us, but they were saying that in Sudan, our identity, we are Arabs and Muslims. So if you don't identify yourself that way, then you become a second-class citizen.
But what about now? Now you no longer have the Arabs, or if the Arabs are in South Sudan, they have no power.
Yes.
Now you basically reduce yourself into being a Dinka, being a Nuer, being all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, if an individual who happens to be a Dinka, for example, steals millions or billions of money, that particular individual is not stealing that money on behalf of the Dinka.
Yeah, that's correct. The thieves they do not belong to the community.
No.
They steal them and they hide them in the West.
Precisely. Yes. In fact, they help the West create jobs.
Yes.
And make sure that there are no jobs.
Yes.
And no food where they come from.
Yes. Yes. But this is what is happening in Africa in general. Whether you divide the country, still they will steal. Whether you unite the country, still they will steal. But the main issue is that the identity, the identity of the people is very important.
Very, very important.
Even if you become thieves, if you identify yourself you are thieves, then there is no problem. You go and steal yourself.
It is
if
very,
you identify
it
yourself
is very important to be celebrated, but not to be used against another person's identity.
I know. Okay, we are not saying that when the South Sudanese, when they separated from Sudan, it was meant that they will come and torture themselves. It was meant they should come and rule themselves through democratic system, through an acceptable way of managing their economy. So they came and they failed like other Africans, like Central Africa. Yes. And they did not secede from somebody.
And they have a lot of diamonds, for example,
even
in Central Africa, they are so
even in Nigeria, they did not divide themselves, but still also they are corrupt.
Well, you have this lady, for example, Madueke, who was the Minister for Petroleum.
Yes.
She stole and spent millions and millions of dollars. You cannot believe it.
Yes.
Buying earrings.
Yes.
Earrings, iPhones, watches. This is a graduate of Cambridge University.
Yes.
A graduate of Howard University.
Yes. But Sagasali, what will happen now is that the Sudanese government, which is going to be, I'm quite sure, it will not be a government which is propagating for war. Because Bashir wanted us not to have stability. So when there is no war in South Sudan, there is no war in Sudan, I'm quite sure economically we will be cooperating.
Let's go back to Sudan and figure out, frankly, how to reach the next destination. We are talking about in 2 years having elections. I hope that we are talking.
3 years.
I hope we are talking about an election that is simply not what is characterized as periodic election, which are in fact selections.
Yes.
I hope we are talking about an election that is free, fair, transparent, verifiable, and credible, whose results reflect at the end of the day the will of the people, not the will of the announcer of the results or the will of the people who have chosen to count the vote. How do we get that? For example, how do we get an independent national electoral commission in the Sudan to guarantee that the next election will be an election, not a selection?
Yes, and actually these are big questions that are supposed to be answered in the upcoming document, including the constitutional, the declaration, the second document that is part of this deal. But having that said, for me, it's not just the election. It's 3 years. Like we still have 3 years to go through the election. My question is this deal going to stand for the next 3 years? Would it work? Would it function as a deal and give us a coherent government that works together, both parties work together to come to the point where we have election? I doubt, for 2 reasons. The first one, the Sudanese people right now are asking for accountability, which is basically to help to have those involved in all the massacres that happened since December 2018
because
accountable.
Without accountability, you cannot even talk about democracy.
But you are talking about impunity because some of those who are accused of being involved in the crimes are part of the TMC.
Unfortunately, the good doctor, time happens not to be.
I understand.
Next time, I'm sure we'll have another show. Well,
we do understand.
On that note, thanks to our guests, Dr. Shaza El-Mahdi and Atem Garang Deng Kuwek. And thanks to our audience for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter, the Sudanese people. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.